Mark was about to sign his bankruptcy papers, his hands shaking so badly the sheet nearly slipped off the desk. He leaned down, took a deep breath to steady himself, and right then, the office door swung open. A cleaning lady walked in, freezing when she saw him on the verge of tears. She asked just one very simple question, but that question was enough to turn his life in a completely different direction that very night. Mark used to be the kind of person who made others feel like everything in his life was exactly where it needed to be. He walked into meeting rooms with confident posture, a clear voice, and eyes always fixed on the future. The mid-sized tech company he built had earned him a reputation most young people only dared to dream about. Mark once believed that everything would keep rising if he just worked harder, invested more, and never stopped pushing to expand his vision. Back then, he lived as if he could never fall. Strategy meetings happened non-stop. Ambitious plans were laid out without hesitation. He believed he understood the market. He believed he could outrun the big corporations with agility and bold decision-making. That belief was so strong it blinded him to the warning signs that were slowly appearing. One of Mark's biggest decisions was expanding the product line too fast. He chose a new direction he considered breakthrough, and he didn't hesitate to pour almost all of the company's resources into it. But the market shifted in ways he never anticipated. Stronger competitors suddenly jumped in, and what Mark thought would take his company to the next level ended up becoming the very weakness that pushed everything out of his control. One investor pulled out, then another. Veteran employees started leaving because they no longer believed in his strategy. Every time someone walked out of the company, Mark felt like he was losing a piece of himself. He tried to convince them to stay, but his promises no longer carried any weight. Meetings grew heavier. The numbers in the financial reports kept him awake night after night. The debt piled up fast, like a giant shadow chasing right behind him. The pressure closed in on all sides, and Mark felt like someone trying to fight off a storm with his bare hands. He kept thinking that if he just pushed a little harder, he could get through it. But things didn't unfold like they had in the past. This storm was stronger, harsher, and there weren't many people standing with him anymore. On the personal side, Mark's life was starting to crack too. His friends noticed he was slowly disappearing from their hangouts. He turned down almost every invitation, always saying he was busy or it wasn't a good time. The truth was, he didn't want anyone to know he was sinking. When family called to check on him, he only gave short answers saying he was fine. But he wasn't fine at all. In his mind, there was always a ticking clock counting down to the day everything would fall apart. Late nights came one after another. Mark sat alone in the office long after everyone else had gone home. The warm yellow light cast a quiet glow over his exhausted face. Before, staying late had been about passion and ambition. Now he stayed because he didn't want to go home, because he was scared to face the reality that all his hard work might disappear into thin air. He stared at the spreadsheets until his eyes burned, yet he still couldn't find a way out. When the lawyer sent over the bankruptcy papers, Mark stayed silent for a long time. He opened them slowly, like peeling back a wound that hadn't healed. The cold lines of text on the page tightened his throat. Just a few months earlier, he'd been talking about doubling growth, and now he was holding the documents that would end his career. Everything had happened too fast, too brutally. That night, Mark returned to the office even later than usual. The building was almost completely silent, with only the low hum of the air conditioning filling the space. Outside, the sky was pitch black, and no light felt strong enough to give him any sense of comfort. He sat down at his desk and spread the bankruptcy papers out in front of him. His hand trembled slightly as he held the pen. That feeling was completely foreign to someone who used to be so full of confidence. The silence in the room didn't bring peace. It felt like a vast, empty void. It was the kind of moment when life seemed to offer no path forward except accepting defeat. Mark looked through the papers again, but none of the words registered anymore. His mind was so exhausted that only one question remained. Had he truly become a failure? He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but his heart felt so heavy that every beat hurt. Mark lifted the pen. In that moment, he truly believed this was the second he would have to admit that everything was over. As Mark sat quietly in that still, silent room, the pen resting between his slightly trembling fingers, the door behind him suddenly swung open. The sound was small but enough to startle him. He looked up and saw Janet walking in with her familiar cleaning cart. She entered the room naturally. Just like every other evening, she came to clean the office. Janet had no idea she had stepped in at the exact moment when Mark was standing on a line he wasn't sure he could cross. She gave him a small, routine smile, but it faded the instant her eyes met his face. Under the warm yellow light, she could clearly see the exhaustion he'd been trying to hide. The red eyes, the uneven breaths, and the way his hand was gripping the pen as if it were the last thing he had left to hold on to. Janet stopped, not stepping any farther into the room. She watched Mark for a moment, then gently asked, her voice soft, but somehow ringing clearly through the quiet space. "Are you okay?" The question was so simple that most people would have treated it as nothing more than polite small talk. But for Mark, it was like a crack forming in a dam, and all the emotions he'd been holding back suddenly burst through. He lowered his head, trying to hide his reddened eyes, but it was too late. Tears hit the page in front of him, and Mark braced himself against the desk as if he needed something to hold on to, just to stay upright. For the first time in months, he didn't have the strength to pretend he was fine or to act strong anymore. Janet was surprised, but her reaction carried no awkwardness or discomfort. She didn't press him with questions, didn't try to guess what was happening. She simply rested her hand on the handle of her cart and stood there in quiet respect. Her presence alone made the room feel a little less suffocating, even though Mark was still struggling to breathe steadily. She took a small step toward the desk, her voice soft, as if speaking to someone who just had a terrible day. "If you need a few minutes, I can wait." The way she said it carried no pressure. It held a gentle warmth, the kind that only seems to come from people who don't judge you at all. Mark tried to wipe his tears, but the more he tried, the less control he had. He felt embarrassed letting someone who was practically a stranger see him fall apart like this, yet he couldn't stop the emotions that had been crushing him for so long. He looked over at Janet, his eyes exhausted, and for the first time in months, he told the truth about how he felt. His voice was hoarse, each word pulled down by the weight of everything he'd been carrying. He said he had failed, that everything he built was collapsing, that he no longer knew who he was besides someone losing everything. He talked about the mistakes he'd made, the fear of facing reality, the feeling of uselessness that wrapped around him every morning when he woke up. All the things he had never said to anyone. Janet listened without rushing him, without interrupting, without offering advice. She just listened, and that alone was enough for Mark to finally feel like someone was witnessing the despair he'd been carrying by himself. Her silence wasn't indifference. It felt like a safe space, a place where Mark could speak without being judged or looked down on. When he paused to breathe, she simply nodded, as if to say she understood. Not because she knew anything about his business or his debt, but because everyone has a moment in life when they hit rock bottom. She looked at him with calm, steady eyes. "It's hard when everything hits at once," she said slowly, "but it doesn't mean you have to go through it alone." The words weren't poetic, but in this moment, they were something Mark had never heard from anyone around him. The people he worked with always expected him to be strong, always assumed he would handle everything. But Janet, the cleaning lady who came in only to tidy up after a long day, was the one who saw his real exhaustion and didn't look away. Mark looked down at the bankruptcy papers in front of him. The pen was still there, the ink dot he hadn't placed yet, waiting like it needed one final decision. But Janet's presence had completely changed the atmosphere in the room. The tension that had been wrapping around him like a tightening rope suddenly loosened. He no longer felt the urge to rush toward ending everything. Janet didn't tell him what to do, and she didn't know the full story, but her kindness alone was enough to pull him back from that darkest moment. He set the pen down on the desk and exhaled. Not in disappointment, but in the feeling of someone who had just been caught right before falling into a pit he'd been too afraid to even look at. Mark didn't say anything more, but he knew that because Janet had walked in at the exact right moment, he simply couldn't sign that paper. Not because all his problems had disappeared, but because, in that moment, he realized he could still pause and breathe, even if just a little. Janet had no idea she'd done something important, but for Mark, that small act was enough to pull him back from the edge when he thought he had already fallen. Janet stood there with the same calm demeanor she'd had when she first walked in, and when she saw Mark slowly regaining his breath, she gently moved her cart to the side so it wouldn't block his space. The air in the office was still heavy, but not nearly as suffocating as it had been minutes earlier. Mark looked at her, saying nothing, but Janet understood he was trying to steady himself after the emotional storm that had just hit him. She rested her hand on the corner of the desk near where he sat, close enough to show she was there, but still giving him respectful space. Once he seemed a bit more grounded, Janet softly said, in a voice that felt like it belonged to someone who had carried her own share of life's sadness, that she understood what it was like to face things that slipped out of your control, because she had been through that herself. Janet didn't tell her story in some grand or dramatic way. She simply started from the moment when everything in her life had nearly fallen apart. She used to work at a small restaurant, a job stable enough to help her family maintain a simple life. But one day, the restaurant closed because the owner went bankrupt. Around that same time, her husband left without warning. He scribbled a few short words on a piece of paper and disappeared from her life, taking with him whatever belongings he felt were his. When she reached this part of the story, Janet's voice didn't shake, and there was no bitterness in it. She spoke as if she had already walked past that pain long ago, and now it was nothing more than a chapter in her life she had learned to accept. She said the months that followed were the hardest she had ever faced. She had to raise her child alone and take any job she could find just to keep their life from collapsing. She worked night shifts at a convenience store and then rushed to morning shifts at a supermarket stocking shelves. The pay was low, the hours were long, but Janet said the thing that hurt her most wasn't the exhaustion. It was the helplessness she felt when her child asked why their dad wasn't there anymore. Even then, she tried to answer as gently as she could, making sure her child never felt abandoned. Then came the moment when Janet couldn't afford rent anymore. She told him that one night, she and her child had to sleep in their car in an empty parking lot. It was so cold she gathered every old piece of clothing she had to cover her child. She leaned her head against the car window, keeping watch while trying not to cry for fear of waking the little one. That was the night Janet felt she had truly hit the bottom of her life. But the next morning, she still had to take her child to school and go to work as if nothing had happened. She said that in moments like that, people don't have many choices. You either collapse and get swallowed whole, or you stand up even if your legs are shaking. Mark sat still, listening to every word Janet spoke. He had never imagined that the woman standing in front of him, the one he usually only saw pushing a cleaning cart down the hallways, had gone through things that would break most people. Janet said she made it through her story slowly, but every step was steady. Not because she was stronger than anyone else, but because she knew that if she didn't stand up, no one could do it for her. Janet talked about how she believed in second chances. Not big opportunities, not anything glamorous, just small moments that give people a chance to start over in the most humble way. She said that when she got this office cleaning job, it was the first time in a long while she felt like she had a foundation again. The job wasn't fancy, the pay wasn't high, but it gave her stability, helped her child stay in school, and more importantly, it reminded her that she still had value. When Mark looked at her, he saw something in Janet he had never noticed before. Not just a cleaning lady, but someone who had survived challenges far heavier than the ones he was facing. Janet didn't boast or call herself strong, but the way she told her story showed a kind of patience he had never had. She said that sometimes sincerity and patience are stronger than wealth or reputation, because wealth can vanish, reputation can collapse, but kindness and resilience don't disappear so easily. Those simple, unpolished words moved Mark deeply. Not because they sounded inspirational or poetic, but because they were so real. He realized Janet had gone through things far scarier than anything he was facing, and yet she still carried warmth in her voice and calmness in her eyes. That made Mark feel smaller for a moment, but in a way that brought back a humility he hadn't felt in a long time. Mark didn't say a word while Janet spoke, he just listened, and when she finished, he understood that her strength didn't come from anything she said. It came from who she was, from the way she stood there, steady, kind, and unshaken, even though life had never treated her gently. Janet had walked through darkness, but she hadn't let that darkness claim her. And that made Mark reconsider so many things he had always assumed he understood. The words Janet had just shared still lingered in the quiet air of the room as Mark sat motionless, as if trying to fit pieces of her story into his own life. He could clearly feel that what Janet said wasn't meant to comfort him out of politeness. It was the truth from someone who had lived through hardships he had never tasted. That sincerity was something he couldn't ignore. He looked down at his own hands, then at the bankruptcy papers on the desk, and for the first time, he felt something inside him shift, like a patch of dry, cracked earth finally touched by water. That conversation stirred up something inside him, a feeling he had abandoned long ago, the willingness to look at himself honestly. He remembered the period when he was at the peak of his success, when his company was growing fast and people talked about him as a rising leader. He had lived through those days with a confidence that often slipped into arrogance. He used to believe he understood everything, that he couldn't possibly make a major mistake. Meetups with friends had turned into moments where he boasted about his projects and his vision, instead of listening to their stories. The longtime employees who had been with him from the early days, he treated them like people who would always be there for him, not individuals with their own lives, dreams, and limits. While chasing success, he forgot that relationships needed to be cherished, not treated as items on a list of things he assumed he owned by default. Looking back, Mark realized he hadn't lost many things because his business failed. He lost them because he once believed he couldn't lose them. Success had made him think everything naturally belonged to him. And when things started to collapse, the fall hit harder because he had never prepared himself to face it. But after hearing Janet's story, he suddenly understood that he hadn't truly lost everything the way he kept telling himself. He had only lost the things he was used to holding, the things he assumed would always be there. Janet's life showed that people can stand back up even when they lose far more than that. What mattered wasn't what slipped from their hands, but how they used those empty hands to begin again. Mark took a deep breath, as if trying to push all the heavy thoughts out of his chest. He remembered the nights he was so terrified he couldn't bring himself to check his bank account. The days when looking at the financial reports made his heart tighten. But now he understood that what scared him wasn't the debt or the bankruptcy papers. He was afraid of being seen as a failure. He was afraid of looking into someone's eyes and seeing the disappointment he imagined. He was afraid of admitting he wasn't perfect. All those fears had made him run instead of face reality. And they had almost pushed him to sign a paper just to escape the weight on his shoulders. Not because he truly wanted to end his journey. Janet looked at him with gentle eyes. She didn't say much, but when Mark finally lifted his head, she softly told him that sometimes a fall is how people learn to stand steadier later on. It wasn't a rehearsed line or some deep philosophy. It was the honest truth from someone who had gotten back up more times than she cared to count. Her words hit Mark in a way he didn't expect, because they came from someone who had no reason to advise him other than simple kindness. Mark looked back at the bankruptcy papers. The pen was still there, but now he no longer felt the pressure to sign it right away. A part of him knew the problems hadn't disappeared. He was still in debt, and the company was still in danger. But what had changed was that he no longer felt cornered. He didn't want to make a decision just because he was desperate. Mark placed his hand on the stack of documents, then pulled it a little farther from him. He didn't tear it up or throw it away. He just moved it to a place where it no longer pushed him toward signing. That was the moment Mark realized he needed time to rethink everything, not to run from it. He didn't know how things would turn out, but he knew he wasn't ready to end it all. For the first time in months, he felt a small but genuine sense of space inside his chest. A moment of relief, just big enough to help him see that maybe he still had a chance. One he simply hadn't dared to look at before. Mark straightened up, took a deep breath, and in that moment, he realized he was no longer completely drowning in fear. His conversation with Janet hadn't solved everything, but it helped him see himself more clearly, and that alone was the first step toward getting back on his feet. When Mark decided to set aside the bankruptcy papers, he knew he had to face something he'd been avoiding for far too long. He needed to talk to the people still left at the company. Honestly this time. The next morning, he called the core team into a small meeting room he used to reserve for discussing new projects. The atmosphere was heavier and quieter than usual, but Mark no longer wanted to hide anything. He stood before them, not with the confident posture he once had, but with a sincerity he hadn't shown in months. He admitted that his mistakes were the reason the company had ended up where it was. He told them clearly that he wanted to start over from the ground up, with a more realistic plan and a clearer direction. The people in the room watched him closely. Some looked surprised, while others seemed relieved that Mark was finally facing the truth. No one blamed him, no one criticized him. They simply listened. When Mark finished speaking, he presented a proposal to restructure the entire operation, cutting off the unprofitable business segments, shutting down costly projects that brought little value, and keeping the core product that had once built the company's reputation. He wanted to focus on what the company did best instead of chasing untested ideas. The decision to cut back wasn't easy. It meant some teams had to stop working altogether, and a few plans Mark had once poured so much hope into had to be abandoned. But this time, Mark chose to face reality, instead of clinging to things that were dragging the company down. He spent days analyzing each part of the business, listening to the HR team, and making the tough decisions he had avoided before. The workflow became simpler, costs went down, and a new direction slowly began to take shape. After finishing the internal plan, Mark began reaching out to the creditors. He didn't avoid them like before. He requested meetings, sat down with each one, and honestly explained the situation along with his recovery plan. In every meeting, Mark made it clear that the company was struggling, but not beyond saving. He asked for extensions and explained that he was restructuring seriously to make repayment possible. Some creditors were skeptical, but the way he presented things showed them he was no longer scrambling blindly. He was genuinely trying, and that made them reconsider. Not everyone agreed, but a few chose to give Mark more time. What convinced them wasn't just the new plan, it was the clear change in his attitude. Mark was no longer trying to prove he was right. He was someone trying to fix what had gone wrong. And that, in its own way, was more persuasive than numbers ever could be. Meanwhile, as he worked to rebuild the company, Mark continued to run into Janet whenever their paths crossed in the office. Their conversations didn't always revolve around work or struggles. Sometimes it was just a simple greeting, sometimes a few quiet minutes standing together in the hallway as her evening shift began. Mark saw Janet as the person who had pulled him back from his darkest moment. He never said it outright, but the respect in his eyes every time he looked at her made it impossible to miss. What made their connection special wasn't their circumstances or the difference in their jobs. It was the way they talked to each other as two ordinary human beings, with no hierarchy and no distance between them. Janet didn't see Mark as a once successful businessman, and Mark didn't see Janet as a cleaning lady. They met at a very human point, where kindness and sincerity mattered more than titles or income. Those brief encounters brought Mark a sense of peace he couldn't find in meetings or in the pile of emails waiting on his desk. Thanks to the bold changes and the support of the loyal employees who stayed, the company slowly began to stabilize. The people who remained didn't stay because they thought things would be easy. They stayed because they saw that Mark had changed. The impulsiveness was gone. So was the blind ambition. Now he was calmer, more willing to listen, and knew when to pause and reassess. The financial reports were still difficult, but they were no longer spiraling out of control. Loyal customers helped keep the company running. Step by step, everything moved back into a steady enough rhythm that the company was no longer teetering on the edge. Mark knew the road ahead was still full of challenges, but he also knew he wasn't facing them alone anymore. And more importantly, he no longer looked at them with fear. What remained after the fall had become the foundation for rebuilding. And this time, he chose to stand firmly on that foundation, one step at a time, instead of chasing the things that had once made him fall. On another late evening, when the whole building had fallen into its usual silence, Mark returned to his office, a new habit he'd formed over the past few weeks. The heaviness from before was gone, though something inside him still pulled him back to the room that had once witnessed his downfall. On his desk, the bankruptcy form was still there, its corner slightly curled from the number of times he had touched it while thinking. He picked it up, stared at it for a long moment, then set it down carefully, as if facing a piece of his past he didn't want to erase completely. That paper was no longer a symbol of failure. It felt more like a reminder of the moment he had almost given up, almost ended everything, just because fear had blinded him to the hope that was still left. He turned on the desk lamp, took a deep breath, and leaned against his chair, letting himself relive the moment Janet walked into that room. If she had come in 1 minute later, if she hadn't asked that question, if he hadn't allowed himself to be honest in a moment of weakness, his life might have taken a turn he wasn't ready to face. He understood now that keeping the bankruptcy form wasn't about regret or hesitation. It was a reminder that he had once stood at the edge, and that someone's small act of kindness had pulled him back. He wanted to remember that, so he would never underestimate the power of simple goodness. The next day, when Janet arrived for work, Mark waited for her in the hallway near his office. He didn't want to do this through an email or a message. When Janet approached, he greeted her with a smile and asked if she could come in to talk for a moment. She looked slightly nervous, unaccustomed to being invited into his office. Mark quickly reassured her that nothing was wrong. He talked about the past few days, about how their conversation had helped him regain clarity and the determination to fix things. Then, he told her he wanted to give her a raise and offer additional support for her family, because he knew how hard her job was and believed she deserved far more than what she had. Janet stayed quiet for a moment. She looked at Mark, then gently shook her head. She thanked him for the gesture, but said she didn't want any special treatment. She just wanted to keep doing her job as usual, to be seen with fairness rather than as someone receiving charity. She told him that what she did that night wasn't because she expected anything in return. She simply did what she believed anyone should do when they see someone else at their breaking point. She said it in such a plain, honest way that Mark had to stand still for a long moment just to let the meaning settle in. When Janet left the room, Mark stayed behind, thinking about everything she had just said. He realized that the lesson she brought him wasn't only in her life story, it was in the way she treated him. Gentle, sincere, without asking for anything except the chance to live by her own values. He understood that small kindness, when offered at the right moment, can pull someone back from their own fear. He understood that a person's true worth isn't measured by their bank account, revenue, or surface-level success. It's found in how they treat others, in the kindness they hold on to even when life has tested them far too much. He also understood that everyone carries an untold story inside them, and if he didn't learn to listen, he would keep missing the very things that might change the way he sees the world. That evening, Mark stood alone in his office again, but his state of mind was completely different. He looked at the bankruptcy papers one last time, then placed them in a separate drawer. Not to use them, but to remember that he had once stood at that moment and chosen another path. He turned off the desk lamp, stepped into the hallway, and felt the quiet no longer pressing down on him. That silence now carried a lightness he hadn't felt in months, as if he had regained a part of himself that fear had taken away. When Mark walked out of the building, the night air was still cold, but the wind no longer made him shrink into himself. He knew he wasn't free of hardship yet, but he also knew he had regained the most important thing, faith in himself. And as he crossed the open courtyard, he thought about Janet's question that night. A simple question, never meant to change anyone's life. Yet, it had pulled him back from the edge. He understood then that sometimes all it takes is one kind question, one quiet moment of listening, one small act of care to change the course of someone's life who's standing far closer to the edge than we realize. In the end, Mark's story shows that sometimes what pulls a person back from the edge isn't grand advice or a perfect plan. It's a single, honest moment between two human beings. One simple question was enough to awaken a sense of hope he thought he had lost. Small acts of kindness can create big change, and kindness that comes from the heart will always be stronger than any material success. What about you? Has someone ever shown up at the right moment and helped you get back on your feet? Or have you ever done that for someone else? If this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next meaningful story. Thank you for taking the time to listen.